Hey everyone, Michelle Markey with Medina Domestic Art Studio. This is going to be a tutorial video on how to color this particular butterfly. I am doing a class next week, so in the hopes of putting more simplified videos out there, I'm recording this video in advance before I end up teaching the class. This is a Kinship Creations embroidery pattern. Her number is KK1478. I don't know that she is still in business, but I do believe her patterns are still available through Anne the Grand embroidery online site. She may even have her own. By the way, the word is Kinship and Creations is spelled with a K, hence why it's KK. Anyway, I designed an entire quilt of 9 of her butterflies and colored them with a variety of tools. Now, real quick, I want to go over the tools that I'm using. I'm going to put this here so that you can see what I'm talking about. First and foremost is Lumiere Bright Gold. That is the gold that is used throughout the butterfly here. And this is a paint. Even though it's not specifically a fabric paint, it is a metallic paint, acrylic, that works very well on fabric. Many people use this. So this is what I recommend to beginners if they want to start painting with a paint. The second thing that we're going to be using are these Fabrico fabric markers. Now, these are both made with tsukineko ink. And I've done other videos on tsukineko ink. I'll make sure that I spell out the tools and where you can find them below. These I have available on my website. If you're interested in them as I work through this video, you can contact me about the colors that I have available. Finally, the other tool that I'm going to be using today are inktense pencils. Now, this is probably the most popular of all fabric coloring tools that many quilt artists and many other textile artists use in coloring on fabric. The fabric that I am using is white cotton sateen. I have stitched this block out in advance. That is primarily how I teach my beginners, is using an already stitched out pattern that has got wide enough areas that's easy to use and easy to color, but still has some variation in design that makes it interesting. So without further ado, let me also introduce you to some of the tools that we'll be using with this. First and foremost is fabric medium. Now, fabric medium is an acrylic polymer. If you want to know more about it, you can go look on my playlists and look for everything you ever wanted to know about fabric medium. I have a whole video on the various different manufacturers of fabric medium. I actually make my own using Pro Chemical and Dye materials. That also is available on my playlist as a step-by-step process on how to make your own fabric medium. The other thing that I've got are 2 different types of Taklon brushes. This is a synthetic. They typically are used with acrylics. They're very stiff. This is what you want. I've just got a kind of what I call a medium and a small that I'll be using as throughout this. Last but not least, a paint palette. You saw at first my paper towels. Always keep those handy. Water to clean out your brushes with. And that's just about it. Now, I actually have the work on a piece of foam board that actually has a small bit of Mylar plastic underneath it. That's just to protect the table surface that I'm working on. Okay, so with this, let's start coloring. Now, I am not doing this entire block. What I am doing is going to show you the various different techniques that I used in coloring this. So even though you may want to see the whole thing colored out, honestly, in my feedback from various different viewers, many people find it's pretty boring when they have to sit there and watch the whole process. And so I'm going to try to limit it to just the techniques used here. Now, the one thing I also want to point out is if you go to my website, and I will include the links below in the description, this is my paint by number system that I have now been using on almost all of the various different kits that I create. So I have a list of all of the coloring tools over here. Again, since this is going to be for a class, we're using inktense pencils. That's color number 1. Number 2 is the fabric marker burgundy, this one right here. Number 3 is lipstick pink. The pencil is pink flamingo is number 4. And then last but not least is the Lumiere paints. Now when I number these, that's typically in the number of how I might use them, but that's not necessarily the case. It's typically the most ideal to start it with the top first and work your way down. But this has so many different colors all over the place. I'm actually going to start with the easiest coloring tool first, and then I will move on to the various different spots along the butterfly. Okay, the one thing I want you to pay attention to on this Fabrico marker, it has a small tip. Let's take a look at that real quick. So very small tip at one end. This is my preferred tip to use. And then you have a brush tip at the end. Now, the reason why I often don't like to use the brush tip is it can bleed, particularly if the pen is relatively new. Tsukineko ink that's in this marker is permanent. However, everything that we do here today will have to be heat set. We'll talk about that at the end when I finish up all the techniques. So again, back to using the preferred small size. I like it just because it can get into the areas of the stitching. So with that, let's just start coloring. And again, I'm going to refer back to number 3. Let's take a look at this again. So number 3 are these areas right here. So let's just start coloring that. And when you do this, just kind of put your finger on where you know the first one, because getting started with a blank slate, sometimes you can misjudge where to start coloring. And I normally start just kind of making short, small strokes and then overlapping them as I color. I find this way it just doesn't leave quite as many stroke marks, and it just has a more uniform look to it. So this is all you have to do. And when I'm coloring, and I'm just doing this for effect, I won't over talk. I think I've been told I talk too much on video. So again, come to the next one. Now I made a tiny boo-boo there, but don't worry. First of all, what I tell people is if you make a mistake, that's usually a creative opportunity, but we have ways to fix that. If it's inside an area that's going to be colored, I tell people, unless it's a bright yellow, don't worry about it. If it's outside the area, I have what's known as boo-boo pens, which is nothing more than white out. Now, I'm going to switch here real quick, and I'm going to use the other tip and just show you. Now, sometimes too, the color goes on a little stronger with the tip, and it's bleeding slightly. It may be hard to see on video, but it is bleeding a slight bit. So I'll sometimes start in the middle rather than near the edge so that the bleeding doesn't go outside of the stitching. Now that's the beauty of using a stitched out embroidered version, is the stitching does help keep you inside the lines. All right, and we'll do the other one down here. Again, I see just ever so slightly a bit of bleeding, so it's always best to start in the middle and work towards the edges. You don't see that much in the small tip, but you do definitely see it in the brush tip. All right, now you'll probably notice that they're two different colors. This is an idiosyncrasy of the Fabrico markers. I'm not sure why. I've noticed this now going on 4 or 5 years as I have taught various different classes. So just know that that is something that can happen. Personally, I've only seen it once or twice where the color was completely the opposite, but in something like this, I actually like that because you have just a shade lighter at one tip versus the other, and I think that makes for a very interesting look. Now let's go on to the burgundy, and then I want to show you a couple of tricks. Now the burgundy, if we look again at our instructions, that's number 2. Okay, so that's number 2, and we have number 2 is being used down here as well as these two places right here. What I really want to do is I want to save this. I don't really need to color it, but I definitely want to do it here and here, because then I want to show you a technique using gradation on using the lipstick pink that I was using earlier, okay? So we'll just come down here again, 2, 2, that matches with either side on this. Again, you can, if you use the big tip, start in the middle, go back and forth. Now this, because it's longer, you can use longer strokes, but again, I suggest that in order to keep the appearance of the coloring uniform, that you use straight up and down strokes and go in the direction of the design that you're coloring itself. Now I'm going to save the outside until I get all this, and then you'll notice I'll come in here very carefully and I'll put just a tiny bit of color just along the thread lines. Now you may want to turn your work as you do this, so please keep that in mind as you work. Okay. Also, I'll tell you, if this wasn't being done for video, I would tell you to do all the light colors first and save the dark for last. You can have an issue with bleeding sometimes by putting the dark down first and coming back with the light. So if at all possible, start with the light first. So this side is also done. That is this one right here. We'll come in with number 2 and color that. Okay, now here's what I want to show you. Most people ask about how you can blend easily with these markers, and you can, but it does require some fabric medium. So this is kind of like trick number 1. I'm going to put a tiny bit. I usually don't put more than 3 or 4 drops in the bottom, and I'm going to grab the small headed brush here. In fact, let's get this up here so that you can see this. And I'm going to dip my brush in down here where I want the color to be lighter, which again, let me refer back. You'll see that the color is lighter here and it's darker towards the top. So down at the bottom where I want this to be lighter, I'm going to put in just a little bit of fabric medium, okay? And actually just kind of feather it up as it gets towards the middle. Then what I'm going to do is come along, and I'm going to use again the small tip. I feel that's easier to deal with. And I'm going to start coloring with strokes, and I'm going to color the area without fabric medium first. Then slowly work my way down until I hit the fabric medium. And you can see right off the bat what happens. It immediately goes on lighter. And I'm not even going to carry that all the way down. What I am going to do though is where it came to the fabric medium, I'm going to drag as much color down. That's not really a lot. I want to put fabric color in there, but I don't want it all the way to the bottom because I want to use the fabric medium as kind of acting like a lubricant to move the color down into the bottom so that I get a very, very light color of pink at the very bottom. This allows me then to do some blending. And again, if you have to come along where the stitching is to fill in any little white area, do that after you've gone ahead and colored the whole thing. So let's do that one more time. Actually, let's do this whole thing so that you can see the process. Sometimes this is a bit complicated for some students to pick up and grasp. So I think repeating a process like this doesn't hurt. Okay, now I'm hitting the fabric medium. Notice immediately it goes lighter. Let me just kind of come down to right about there, bring my brush out, and then drag the color down and smooth it up where before. So that looks really good. Now that I'm very pleased with. Now something you can do, and I'm actually going to switch and use the wider end, you can actually rub your brush against that tip and you can see it will pull out some color. So do this if you feel like you're not getting enough color down there, but you don't want to put the pen down for fear of getting too much. So you can drag your brush across the top and pull out color that way. Okay, let's do the other two. Okay. Hitting the fabric medium, coming down, and now using my brush to blend. That really looks good. Now I could have put the color all the way, the fabric medium rather, all the way up. It's not necessary though, because all you're wanting to do is get that little bit of light. Now last but not least, I'm going to come in here and do this last one. And this time I'm going to use our little brush and tip trick. So I'm going to put the small cap back on, pull off the other end. Again, grab some of the ink and come down where the fabric medium is, and there you go. And again, push the bristles up against the stitching. Sometimes that can cause problems. Now the fabric medium will stay wet for about 20 minutes before it starts to dry. So you have some time to work that, which is why I like to do it this particular way. Now, I'm going to show you something else real quick. Remember that we had a separate color up here. It was kind of a darker shade. If we go back up here and look, we have two shades up here. Now, one of the things that you can do is you can come in here with a darker shade of pink. Now, this is another blending technique, and this is done not necessarily with fabric medium. But what I'm doing is I'm using short little strokes, and I'm pulling away at the end so that it feathers out as you reach. So that gives it a nice blended look as well. And you can do that. Just be careful not to put too much down. And if you want, because everything is still wet, these will stay wet for about 3 or 4 minutes. And then the surface, like these are already dry. There's nothing on my fingers. So be aware of that when you are using these, that they do dry out very quickly. But the fabric medium helps slow the drying process down. So that's one of the reasons that I really enjoy using that. Okay, that in a nutshell is basically using fabric markers. So what I will tell my students is that we'll work the entire butterfly first with all of the various different sections that are basically the dark pink and this burgundy color. Now let's move on to the light pink, which is actually done with this Inktense pencil. This is called Pink Flamingo. This is a relatively new color. Inktense pencils, again, as I mentioned, they're very popular. They are made in the UK. They're effectively a watercolor pencil, but the ink that's in here is actually dried India ink. So it too is very permanent. It does need to be heat set in order to be washable, but these are extremely versatile. I would say that over 50% of the people who do textile arts use these in some shape, form, or fashion. I have a ton of videos out on my website that are about the various different techniques with using Inktense pencils. There are a ton of different ways to do this. I'm just going to show you a few for the sake of this video. Now, before I go forward with this, I am going to wash my brush out. And when I do, I'm just swishing it around in the water. And I know this is basic, but some people do forget to do this. I like to grab my brush and get out as much excess water as possible. What you don't want to see happen is put your brush down where you're putting color, particularly on cotton sateen like this. It will bleed all over and you'll have a mess on your hands. Things like that are fixable, but that's not necessarily the context of this video. All right, so what I'm going to do is we have the light pink is in this large area up here, which I think is a perfect area to show how to not only get some basics with Inktense pencils, but it also will help show us some blending on how to do that. And just so if you're following along with the instructions, this is this light number 4. Now, this is the one thing I like to point out in my instructions. When I say light number something, it means you're going to come in and put a very light coloring down. You don't want to be heavy-handed with this. Inktense pencils in and of themselves are very intense colors. So I always tell my students, don't go pressing super, super, super hard and getting strong color right off the bat. You can always layer color in later, but it's always best to start out with a light coloring first And as you can probably see, I'm pressing very, very gently, and I'm just coming in and coloring the area. Once again, I'm coloring very lightly with long strokes, a few little short ones as I get towards the tip. Try to get as much of the color into the really tight areas of the stitching, but don't press very hard. And I always tell people in my class, there are two types of people in my art world. There are heavy-handed people and there are light-handed. I happen to be a very heavy-handed person, which means I have to almost keep my hand above and off the surface so that I don't press too hard. Light-handed people, on the other hand, tend to be so light that you can't even see color. So it's just something that if you watch yourself color, you'll have to make yourself aware of which one you are and react accordingly. All right, now I've brought my fabric medium over, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to get just a bit on the tip of my brush. And I like, again, to start in the middle, and then with kind of a circular scrubbing motion, allow the fabric medium to cover the entire area. Now with the paint bristles of the brush, work it into the corners. You may also have to work it into the stitching, because sometimes the stitching is really tough to get into. This is a bean stitch on this particular pattern, which means it becomes very thick, and so sometimes it's hard to get those bristles in. Now, while this is still wet, what we want to do is come in and put in some darker shading. And here's the beauty of Inktense pencils. So you can probably tell on the video that this is going on quite dark. And let me just make sure there's a little bit there. Okay, once you've done that, and all I did was follow along the stitching, grab your brush and scrub all along the color where you just colored. What that's going to do, it's going to soften the line, and it's going to give you a really, really super nice blended look here. So this, to me, is the core of using Inktense pencils. Now we'll go ahead and do the other one so that you can see the repeat of the process. Okay, I've gotten it in all the areas. Once again, come along, put an outline. And then come in and scrub. Now, there should be enough fabric medium down. If you are a light-handed person, this may be also something you're going to have difficulty with. You need to be not overly generous, but generous enough to where that whole area is colored. Okay, so let me step away. That looks really good. So the goal when doing all of color number 4, is wherever you see number 4, my suggestion is you're going to want to do this as much as possible. Now, if you're feeling really, really adventurous, down here where we have the lipstick pink with a fabric marker, that's one thing I want to point out. You can mix and match. I'm going to put just a tiny bit of fabric medium down here, not a lot, just enough to get it wet again. And now, if I want that kind of contrast pink, I can put a tiny bit of that just right down at the bottom. All right. And then I can come along and scrub that. And now what you've got is kind of a cool little combination of some different colored pinks using different colored tools, which I think really looks good. So that is something that you can do. You can mix between the two. The only really rule that I think you have to be careful with as far as mixing different types of coloring tools, gel pens, for the most part, should be kept off by themselves. They don't tend to play well with the coloring tools that I'm going to show you in this video, and hence that's actually why I don't have any in this video, because they really are something that you just kind of want to keep your distance and not necessarily use, except at the very end. Gel pens are great for over coloring areas like this. But again, that's another video and I'm not going to get into it right now. Just know though that these can play well with each other. Okay, now I do want to continue with some Inktense pencil work, and I'm going to bring over now the green, the beach green, and I want to talk about this kind of shading right here. Now, and really to a certain extent this, but I want to focus more on this area right here. If you'll notice, these colors are very, very light. This happens to be a very dark green. This is called beach green. This is one of my all-time favorite colors in the Inktense 100 set of pencils. And I like it because it's got flexibility like this. So in order to achieve that, we're going to try to do several different techniques. Now, the very first technique that we used over here with this pink is called dry on dry. I used a dry pencil on dry fabric. But for this one here, we're actually going to do a wet on wet technique. And the very first thing I'm going to do is wash my brush out. And again, get the brush good and dried off, particularly for this one, because we want to dip our brush into the fabric medium. And the same area, we're going to coat the entire area with fabric medium. This doesn't need to be done super careful. Just make sure that all the fabric does get wet with the fabric medium, okay? Now, because we want a very light color, it's more difficult to try to color direct on wet. You can do that if you want a super strong color. That's not what we're after. I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to put a couple of drops into the paint palette. And this time I'm grabbing a color, it's called Ionian Green. It has a more olive look to it, which is kind of what I think I used. So once again, stick your tip into, yeah, that's much better. So you can look at the two different colors here and see that they were definitely, and grab a bit more color down here. Now, when you have finished doing this, again, it's very critical to always wipe the pencil tip off. If you leave that on there, it will basically dry and it'll be like encasing the pencil tip in plastic. Now, I don't want this pencil to go too far because we're going to be using it to create some additional shading. But what I really want to do is, again, reference that the corners are a bit darker than the center. So I'm going to start with the corners. Still not quite the right shade, but I have a sneaky suspicion I might have done a dual pencil blend. It's been over 3 years since I created this pattern, so I'm not surprised. I don't remember it. So when you start getting towards the center where we want it to be lighter, we really want to try to drag that color as much as possible from the into the center. You can either come this way, and if you need additional color, come in and again, try not to put it in the center. I did that just a minute ago, and that's probably not the right thing to do. But drag it into making sure you're getting into the stitching on all the sections, okay? Now, that looks good. Again, I think we're gonna have to switch colors here. I think that it was probably a light olive or a different color olive than what either one of these two pencils are. But it's neither here nor there. The point is to tell you exactly how this is supposed to work. And what I am going to do is I'm gonna come back and I actually wanna deepen the color in these corners, leaving this as light as possible. And you may need to spread this out a bit with your brush because this is called a wet on wet technique. You wetted your fabric, and then by putting the color into the fabric medium, you're coloring with wet color. Now what I'm going to do, this is again wet, but the pencil is dry. So this is a dry on wet technique. And what I'm gonna do is come in and I'm gonna put just ever so little bit in either one of these corners because I really want there to be a bit of a stronger color. If you'll notice how much stronger that color goes in, it's why I didn't want to use the pencil to begin with. Once you've done that, just again try to push the color into the thread as much as possible and continue to drag the color out. It will fade, and you'll also notice too that your fabric is still wet, which is good. Again, it takes about 10-15 minutes before it completely starts to dry out. And there you've got a good contrast between the ends and the middle, just by using a little bit of the tip to create some light color, and then coming in and putting in some darker in the center. So that's really it as far as doing blending. So that, again, let's refresh what we've talked about. Dry on dry, which is you color, then you put the fabric medium down, then you come back in, you color against the stitching and blend it out to achieve a blended look. On this particular one, we put the fabric medium down first. We stuck our pencil tip into a little bit of fabric medium, pulled some color off, coated it to get a very light look, starting with the corners and working towards the center. Then once we did that, we came back in with a pencil tip, put a little bit of color in the ends, and then drug the color again back to the center. Okay, one more trick on using pencil, and it's kind of a corollary to what you just saw. I'm going to actually use the same fabric medium that was colored with this pencil tip, because I'm going to put it down here first. And this is the way to get really nice, clean coverage. Because part of the problem using pencils is that pencils can create strong streak marks. And you kind of want to stay away from that, unless that's a very deliberate look. So I'm just going to color that one section. Actually, no, I'll go ahead and do both. Both of these sections are done the same way. Okay. Now, once I have done this, watch this. This is why Inktense pencils are so loved, is that when you color directly on there, do you see how strong that color goes on? Very, very strong. This is the strongest you can possibly get your color to be, is by putting a dry pencil on wet fabric. And then once you do that, you can see why it didn't bother me to use that colored fabric medium, is because the pencil just colors it so strongly. And we'll do now the same thing on this side. Once again, make sure that you're kind of going in the direction of the design itself, so that if you do end up with any streaks for whatever reason, that they're not going to show up all that readily. And I'm not even pressing hard, but because the fabric is still wet with the fabric medium, it just melts the color into the fabric. And then we can come along and clean that up and smooth the color out. Okay, so 3 different ways, from dry to dry, wet on wet, wet on dry. Those are probably 90% of how anybody uses Inktense pencils. Now, one thing real quick, I'm going to show you this, and it's kind of a corollary to this one right here. One thing you can do is you can get a tiny bit of fabric medium and you can rub it. I often rub against the bottom so I don't get too much on my tip. And now I've got a bit of extra color on my brush, and I can come out here and strategically place it where I want without having to use the pencil tip. And I think I'll do the same thing on the opposite side. I'll come in and put a little bit more color down, extend it along the edges. Yeah, that looks good. Maybe just slightly along the bottom. I mean, this becomes a personal preference. By the way, I write my instructions as guidelines. You want to change the color and do something different, please, by all means, be my guest. Because there is nothing sacred about the way I color things. This is really just to learn techniques. Okay, last but not least is learning how to use paints. Paints are a blast. For beginners, however, there's just a lot of things to have to worry about. And that is primarily getting your paint on too thick. Now, I'm going to lay first, since I do want to show you this, I'm going to put down a towel on top of my work. I don't want to accidentally spill paint. The Jacquard Lumiere paints, they need to be shook every single time you use them. This actually comes in a smaller size in the Exciter pack, and this is not exactly the same color, but this is what they come in. I recommend these to start out with. You can buy these. I don't carry these on my website. I carry the small ones. I don't carry these. But this can be found through Amazon, Dick Blick's, Jerry's Artorama. Very decent prices, and a lot of times they have a sale, and I'll usually try to send out information about sales if I see them. Okay, so now it's been shook up. Beautiful stuff. And but here's the thing about using acrylic paints. They dry out very, very fast. So I'm only going to put ever so slightly a bit of paint, as you can see, and then set this aside. And just to be on the safe side, let me pull this off screen, fold this over, and I'm actually going to put this back on the towel. I like to tell my students that when you're first getting into this, you're very, very careful. As you color and you get somewhat tired, you tend to get sloppy. So the other area that you're not working on, cover it up with a paper towel or a towel, and that way it'll protect any potential mistakes. So now, this is, again, very easy, like using fabric markers, except you do need to dip your brush. I try not to get more than just about that on the end of my brush. Now, the gold is right here. I'm just going to show you, I do start in the middle. I work towards the edges. My apologies, there's a helicopter coming by. My dogs do not like helicopters. They do like to bark at it. My sincere apologies. I don't really want to redo this video, so you're just sadly going to have to hear my dog barking. Okay, that's it. Now, of all of the tools that we have here, this has the potential for covering up the thread because it's considered opaque. Whereas the colors that we used both in the fabric markers and in the inktense pencils are considered translucent. You could color a whole lot before you would really ever, if ever, cover up the thread with translucent colors, but the gold is very, very easy to cover up the thread. So you're going to want to be very careful as you work with this. And you need to work quickly. So as I'm coloring this area again, I start in the middle. I kind of push the bristles right up to the line as best as possible. If you need to get into a tight area, my suggestion is use a toothpick, or even nail art tools is another thing that I like to use. They have very tiny little balls at the end of the tool, and you can dip it in there and use that to get color into these tiny little areas. Okay. I'm going to stop there because what I want to do next is, and this is kind of the last trick, is show you how, again, you can blend using paints. Now, anybody has to look at any kind of acrylic artwork can tell that this can occur. It's just how do you go about doing it. But similar to what we did down here, I'm going to do the same thing. Now we have two sections right here that have, let me bring the drawing over. If you'll notice, it goes from dark to light using the gold. So, and there's actually some light in here as well. Let's start out with these. They're the easiest. And once again, I have a tiny bit of white fabric medium in here. I'm going to put that down first where I want the lighter area. I don't cover the whole area, you don't need to. Just put a little bit down there. Then I'm going to dip my brush and I'm going to start at the top. And again, be very careful. Very small strokes when you're working in a little area like this. And as I reach the end, I'm really going to be trying to drag color down into the fabric medium. I need probably a little bit more paint right about here. But I really don't want a whole lot on my brush. I just want to carry it down into the fabric medium. Again, the fabric medium is acting like a lubricant, and it allows that lighter look. And actually, that's pretty darn good. That is a very good one. I'm kind of surprised that I was able to do it working upside down like this. Anyway, that is really it in a nutshell. This butterfly is actually relatively easy, but it can actually look very complex and detailed based on how you come in and color this. Now, there's no rhyme or reason to why I chose the tools that I did or the colors that I did. What is important is when I teach classes, these are the 3 basic techniques and 3 tools that I teach when I start in and teach a beginner class, which is what I considered this butterfly to be. So let's pretend for a moment that we have finished our coloring and we have let it cool completely. So there's a couple of things I want to cover here real quick because I forgot that this class is also going to be using bling, okay? So I've just got some bling right here, and I'm just going to do this real fast because it's going to kill kind of several birds with one stone. I like to just kind of put them down on the table. You know, hang on a second. Let me grab a set of tweezers. Most people do not necessarily like tweezers, but frankly, I do. I think it's the easiest way to manipulate them. Now, what I'm using here are hot fix rhinestones, and I know it's kind of hard to see. Let me zoom in actually real carefully here. There we go. There's a bit of gray stuff on the back that is glue, and so let's just put a few here on the head. Maybe that's it for 2 eyes. All right, so we're going to give the little guy a couple of eyes near his antenna. Now, I would end up picking up the excess rhinestones. You don't want to leave those on. I have had this happen. I know it seems obvious, but since I have had people who have actually ironed the excess on, I want to be as straightforward as possible about this, okay? Now, it's there. And let me just kind of zoom a little bit back out again because I do want you to be able to see everything. Now I'm going to cap this and put it aside. So the very first thing I would do is I would grab some of my paper towels. I'm not kidding you. This is how easy it is, y'all. And I would put it over the bling. Now, if you want to get more, say, easier, I'm actually coming over and grabbing a piece of parchment paper. Either one of these works. Now I'm going to pull the paper towel up and show you why parchment paper could be your preferred method. If I lay that parchment paper down, look at that. I can see through this and I can basically make sure that the bling doesn't move. Now, I don't have my iron turned on because I'm not done with this and I don't want to put the bling on yet, but I did want to go ahead and do this video. So here's my iron. I would end up moving my iron, let's see if I can get this right, to the linen cotton setting, which is the highest setting on this particular iron. I would let this iron heat up for about 5 minutes before I would do this. Okay, once I've done that and my iron's good and hot, no steam, I would set the iron down straight down. And I would press, I'm holding this down firmly, and I would count to 10, maybe 15, depends on how hot your iron gets. If it doesn't get very hot, go to 15. If it's a hot iron, stop at 10. At 10 seconds, I would lift my iron up. I would immediately remove the paper. I would see if they had shifted because you've got a second or two while the glue is still warm to come in and actually push those stones around a bit. After a couple of seconds, they're there. So that is basically how you set a rhinestone. Now what you are doing at the same time is you're heat setting your work. So let's pretend for a second you didn't have rhinestones. What I just showed you would be exactly the same way that you would heat set your work. The difference is that you would put the parchment paper down and you would actually put your iron over and you would overlap it as you went across the pattern, making sure that you moved your parchment paper along with the iron because you want to protect from scorching. So that's it on heat setting. I will assure you that once you have done that, you can then throw it in the wash. I usually like to give it 24 hours just to be safe. And you can wash this without any loss of color or any effect on your work. So there you have it. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. And thanks so much for watching.